You don't know what you're talking about. Judge Joe Brown's voice thundered across the room, his words slicing through the air like a gavel slamming down in anger. He leaned forward, finger jabbing, eyes blazing with the practiced fury of a man who had built his entire reputation on intimidation. It was the kind of moment audiences had come to expect from him, volume over substance, force over reason. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, motionless. She did not flinch. She did not look away. Her gaze was steady, her posture unwavering, her silence more powerful than his roar. In that split second, the tension became cinematic. The clash was not just about two individuals. It was about two eras colliding, two Americas staring each other down. The narration cut in like a drumbeat. In one explosive moment, the courtroom-style theatrics of a TV judge collided with the razor-sharp wit of a rising political star. For the audience watching, it was electrifying. Here was the old guard, loud, brash, convinced that dominance lay in decibels. And here was the new voice, calm, precise, grounded in dignity. The contrast was magnetic. Social media feeds lit up instantly. Is she going to clap back? Is he really shouting at her like that? The suspense spread like wildfire, viewers waiting to see if Crockett would bend or break. But she didn't. She breathed in, her composure radiating through the storm, her stillness louder than his shouting could ever be. The imbalance of energy was glaring. Brown's fury began to feel desperate, as though he was fighting not just her words, but the very shift in culture she represented. The camera caught every detail, his reddening face, her unshaken calm. The room seemed to hold its breath. Viewers sensed that what was about to happen would not be forgotten. This wasn't just another shouting match. This was a test of dignity, a battle for respect, a defining clash between arrogance and resolve. And just as the shouting hit its peak, just as Brown thought he had seized control, Jasmine Crockett opened, her mouth to speak. What came next didn't just silence the room, it changed the entire debate. The shouting was more than a loud exchange. It was a symbol. Every raised octave carried echoes of the past, of boardrooms where women's voices were dismissed, of political stages where arrogance drowned out reason, of a culture that too often mistook bluster for strength. Judge Joe Brown wasn't just yelling at Jasmine Crockett. He was summoning a history that every woman, every person of color, every underdog in America knew all too well. Crockett sat across from him, her presence a quiet rebellion. To some, she was a newcomer, a rising figure not yet burdened with decades of establishment clout. But to her supporters, she represented something larger, the possibility that politics could be both fierce and dignified, unapologetically proud, yet rooted in respect. Her composure in the face of his shouting struck a chord deeper than any single debate could explain. This moment mattered because it wasn't just about policy disagreements or television theatrics. It was about gender dynamics. An older man, once celebrated for his booming authority, attempting to overwhelm a younger woman who refused to shrink. It was about generational divides, a legacy of the way things have always been done, colliding with the urgency of a new generation demanding change. And yes, it was about race, the weight of centuries in which black women, in particular, had been told to stay quiet, defer, and accept less. Crockett's unshaken stare became a lightning rod for everyone who had ever been underestimated. The cameras didn't need narration to underline the stakes, but the story practically wrote itself. Viewers watching live and later on their screens could feel it in their bones. This was about more than Joe Brown versus Jasmine Crockett. This was about whether dignity could hold its ground against arrogance. Could composure truly outshine bluster in an America addicted to outrage? Could silence carry more power than shouting? For Brown, the shouting was a strategy, an attempt to frame himself as the dominant voice, to make Crockett seem small. But for Crockett, every second she refused to flinch was its own counterargument, every calm breath a statement of resistance. The underdog was not retreating. She was gathering strength, and the country noticed. Social media posts framed it instantly. Classic bullying dynamic, but she's not backing down. We've seen this play before, but something feels different this time. Hashtags began bubbling up, clips started circulating, and the online energy swelled. What looked at first like a mismatch, a seasoned, loud-mouthed veteran versus a younger, composed challenger, was transforming into something else entirely. The script everyone thought they knew was already unraveling, because to many watching, it felt like history was about to repeat itself. The pattern was familiar. The loud voice shouts down the calm one, the spectacle overwhelms the substance, and once again the establishment claims victory. But Jasmine Crockett was not reading from that script. She was writing her own. And in, just a moment, the world would see exactly how she planned to turn the tide. To understand why this clash resonated so deeply, you have to understand the man behind the shouting. Judge Joe Brown wasn't just another television personality. For decades, he was a household name, his face a fixture on daytime TV, his booming voice echoing in living rooms across America. He styled himself as the voice of authority, the man, who brought order to chaos with nothing more than his commanding presence and a sharp tongue. For years, that formula worked. Viewers tuned in precisely because he could turn even the smallest disputes into spectacles of control and judgment. But behind the gavel and the charisma, Brown cultivated a reputation built less on fairness and more on intimidation. He thrived on the theatrics of dominance. Instead of carefully weighing perspectives, he often cut people off mid-sentence, belittled their arguments, and shouted them into submission. In a medium where attention was everything, Brown mastered the art of being louder, harsher, and more forceful than anyone else in the room. And in that world of daytime drama, it played well. Over time, however, the cracks in the facade grew harder to ignore. Off-screen, his name was never far from controversy. He became known not just for his rulings on television, but for the remarks he made about women, about politics, about society. Many of his statements revealed a worldview steeped in the past, a nostalgia for a time when respect meant deference to men like him, men who measured authority by the volume of their voice. He called for respect constantly, lecturing younger generations about manners, discipline, and obedience. Yet, when challenged, he abandoned those very principles, lashing out with anger rather than reason. That contradiction was the essence of Judge Joe Brown, a man who demanded respect but rarely offered it. His critics saw hypocrisy. His defenders saw old-school toughness. But to Jasmine Crockett and countless others watching, it was clear. His methods were relics of a bygone era. Theatrics may have worked in a staged courtroom, but in the real arena of politics and ideas, shouting only exposed weakness. Generationally, Brown symbolized the old guard. He came from a time when public figures could shout women down without backlash, when the appearance of control mattered more than genuine dialogue. His entire style was steeped in that tradition: dominate, humiliate, and move on. But America had changed. Audiences were no longer content to see the loudest voice win. Respect now demanded something deeper: integrity, composure, empathy. And Brown's bluster, once seen as strength, increasingly looked like insecurity. Still, for many years, his style worked. Opponents backed down. Guests wilted under his fury. Even colleagues gave way to his domineering energy. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the old rules still applied, that if he raised his voice high enough, others would stay in their place. And in countless encounters, that assumption proved correct. His career, his fame, even his self-image depended on it. But what he didn't account for was someone like Jasmine Crockett, younger, sharper, unwilling to be intimidated. She represented not just herself, but an entire cultural shift. When Brown shouted at her, he wasn't just raising his voice at an opponent. He was testing whether his old playbook still worked in a world that was quickly leaving it behind. And that was the miscalculation. For years, Brown's bluster had been enough to rattle people. For years, the mere performance of anger had carried him through debates and disputes alike. But this time it didn't land. This time his anger looked less like control and more like desperation. This time the audience wasn't laughing along with the theatrics. They were watching, waiting, sensing that the tide was about to turn. Because here's the truth. Judge Joe Brown embodied the arrogance of an era where power meant never having to listen, where respect was demanded, but never reciprocated. But against Jasmine Crockett, that arrogance became his weakness. His voice might have filled the room, but hers was about to fill the story. For years, this style intimidated opponents. But this time, he miscalculated. Long before the cameras caught her unflinching calm in the face of Judge Joe Brown's shouting, Jasmine Crockett had been tested by struggles that left her with a resilience no opponent could shake. Her story wasn't written on sound stages or television sets. It was written in courtrooms, in neighborhoods overlooked by power, in late nights of preparation and early mornings of advocacy. She was not handed a platform. She carved it out of the granite walls of a system that often told her she didn't belong. Crockett's journey began with the law. She entered the profession not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. She saw how injustice bled. Through the cracks of society, how communities like hers were too often given the short end of the stick. She became the lawyer who took on the cases that didn't come with headlines or hefty paychecks, defending the vulnerable, the overlooked, the people who couldn't afford a voice. In those courtrooms, she learned the true weight of power, not as a weapon, but as a shield for the people who had none. From there, activism wasn't optional, it was inevitable. Crockett stepped into protests, into marches, into meetings where decisions about people's lives were made without their input. She didn't see politics as a career ladder. She saw it as a battlefield for justice. For her, every rally, every speech, every cause was a reminder that the law on paper meant little without the courage to enforce it in reality. She fought not just as a lawyer, but as an activist willing to put herself on the line for the dignity of her community. The leap into politics came with its own storm. As a young black woman stepping into halls long dominated by older, often white, often male lawmakers, she carried the weight of being underestimated. Colleagues and critics alike dismissed her at first as too young, too fiery, too untested. The whispers were familiar. She'll burn out. She doesn't belong here. She'll never make it past one term. But every doubt only hardened her resolve. Instead of shrinking under the pressure, she turned it into fuel. She knew her community had carried her this far, and she would not let their faith go unanswered. Her underdog struggle became her strength. Crockett was the politician who showed up where others didn't. In churches, in schools, in community centers, where constituents weren't asking for favors but for fairness. She carried the voices of people who were tired of being overlooked and turned their frustrations into legislative action. Every speech she delivered, every fight she picked inside the chamber, wasn't just about her name or her career. It was about proving that dignity and justice could still survive in a system that often chewed up those ideals. And through it all, she never let go of her roots. She carried the values of service, of family, of community pride. She wore her identity not as baggage, but as armor. Being a young black woman in politics meant facing endless obstacles, but it also meant representing a lineage of resilience, a tradition of women who held families together through storms, who fought battles quietly and publicly, who refused to be erased from history. Crockett understood that she wasn't standing alone. She was carrying the weight of generations on her shoulders, and she carried it proudly. The empathy she inspired didn't come from staged moments or scripted lines. It came from authenticity. People saw themselves in her story, immigrants carving out a life in a land that doubted them, workers fighting for a seat at the table, young people demanding to be heard, women facing down dismissive colleagues. She was, in every way, a reflection of America's unfinished promise. And that reflection was powerful. It's why when Judge Joe Brown raised his voice, the contrast was so stark. Brown embodied the past, bluster, intimidation, the belief that shouting equaled winning. Crockett embodied the future, steady, rooted, unwilling to trade her dignity for the cheap thrill of yelling back. Her calm in that moment wasn't just the product of training. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. She had been shouted down before. She had been underestimated before. She had been told, "You don't know what you're talking about," in more ways than one, from law school, classrooms to political chambers. But every time, she came back stronger, sharper, and more determined. That night with Judge Joe Brown wasn't the first test. It was simply the most public. And it was that resilience, the kind honed not in comfort but in conflict, that prepared her for the moment America would never forget. She had fought for justice in quiet courtrooms. She had demanded dignity in crowded rallies. She had stood her ground in legislative battles. But now, she would face her trial not behind closed doors, but under the glare of millions of watching eyes, and that very resilience would be tested in front of millions. The air was already charged when Judge Joe Brown leaned forward again, his words sharper this time, cutting across Jasmine Crockett before she could finish a thought. "Hold on, young lady," he barked, his hand slicing through the air. "You don't get to rewrite history just because you don't like the facts." His tone dripped with finality, as if volume alone could close the case, but Crockett didn't flinch. She began her reply, steady and measured, only to be cut off again. Brown raised his voice louder. No, let me finish. You listen." His interruptions came like rolling thunder, each one crashing down before her sentence could reach the ground. Every exchange became a spark, the tension ratcheting higher with each interruption. The audience could feel the heat of it, the sharp clash of composure versus chaos. Crockett's calm answers tried to surface, but Brown's voice kept rising, drowning her out in an attempt to control the narrative. Yet her eyes never wavered. She let him finish, then tried again, her tone carrying a weight that wasn't dependent on decibels. Narration underscored the moment. Every interruption was a spark, and the room felt like it could explode at any second. The contrast was glaring. Brown's body language was all aggression, leaning forward, hands pounding the table, voice straining to dominate. Crockett's body language was restraint, shoulders back, chin lifted, hands steady. The visual told a story of its own. Viewers didn't need a transcript to understand what was happening. One side was trying to intimidate, the other was refusing to bow. Spectators leaned in, waiting. Each time Brown cut her off, the expectation grew heavier. Would she snap back? Would she finally raise her voice to match his? The suspense was thick, like a held breath that stretched too long. Social media watchers typed in real time, "How much more can she take?" If this were me, I'd already be yelling back. The tension became unbearable precisely because Crockett didn't break. Instead, she let the storm build. She gave him rope, enough to shout, enough to rant, enough to reveal that his fury was not strength but desperation. The louder he became, the smaller he looked. And the calmer she remained, the more powerful her silence became. It was a reversal unfolding in slow motion. The supposed aggressor losing control, the underdog gaining ground without moving an inch. Brown's voice cracked as he pushed harder, his words spilling over each other in his rush to reassert control. "This is the problem with your generation. No respect. No discipline. No understanding of how the real world works." His voice was nearly a shout now, veins visible, his face reddening with effort. He believed he was delivering a lesson, the same kind of lecture that had once earned him applause. But the audience wasn't applauding. They were waiting, and Crockett was still silent, still steady, still letting him empty himself of fury. Each interruption, each insult, each attempt to erase her words only heightened the stakes. The silence before her reply became its own kind of performance, one that drew the audience closer, hearts pounding, waiting for the inevitable break in the storm. The room was on edge. The spectacle had reached its boiling point. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't sustainable. Something had to give. And when it did, the story would pivot forever. Because when the shouting peaked, Jasmine Crockett finally delivered a response no one expected. The moment had reached a fever pitch. Judge Joe Brown's voice was still echoing in the air, the force of his shouting hanging like smoke after an explosion. He leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily, convinced he had seized control of the narrative once and for all. For a beat, it seemed as though he had drowned out everything: the discussion, the atmosphere, even the possibility of rebuttal. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was expectation. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice was soft, almost too soft at first, a contrast so sharp it cut through the noise like glass. "Are you finished?" she asked, the calmness of her tone dripping with something Brown hadn't expected. Authority. The room froze. Every ear tilted toward her, every eye locked onto the young Congresswoman who had just turned the tables with 5 words. Brown blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. The confidence in her question didn't come from volume. It came from certainty. Crockett didn't need to match his fury. She needed only to remind him and everyone watching that dignity speaks louder than rage. She let the silence stretch, a deliberate pause, long enough for discomfort to creep in, long enough for Brown's face to betray a flicker of uncertainty. The crowd shifted in their seats. Online, the comments rolled in like waves. "She's got him." "Wait for it." "This is the calm before the storm." Then, with unflinching precision, she began. "You shout about respect, Judge Brown," she said evenly. "But respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And when you raise your voice at me, when you try to silence me, you're not teaching discipline. You're proving exactly why voices like mine are needed in the first place." Gasps rippled through the audience. Murmurs filled the silence. Brown shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching on the table. The man who thrived on rattling others now looked rattled himself. Crockett pressed forward, each word measured, each pause intentional. "You call my generation undisciplined, but discipline is being calm when others try to provoke you. Discipline is standing tall when someone twice your age, twice your size, thinks volume makes them right. Discipline is knowing your worth without needing to scream it into a microphone." The crowd hummed with energy, a collective awareness that something historic was unfolding. Phones lit up as people clipped the moment in real time, captions flashing across timelines. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." She just ended him. Brown's eyes darted, searching for a point of interruption. But for once he stayed silent. Crockett had seized the rhythm, and the rhythm was undeniable. She leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of truth. "You see, Judge, my community raised me to understand something simple. Dignity outlasts noise. Yelling fades. Respect remains. And if you believe shouting me down makes you the stronger one, then you've forgotten what strength really is." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond, each one sending ripples through the room. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Viewers could almost hear hearts pounding in unison. Then came the final turn, the universal. Reframing that transformed a clash into a lesson. "What you call disrespect, I call resilience. Because every time someone tries to talk over me, I remember the people I represent. They don't have the luxury of raising their voices in rooms like this. They count on me to speak calmly, firmly, and truthfully. And I will never let your shouting stop that. The emotional payoff hit instantly. The crowd erupted, not in wild applause, but in a wave of gasps, whispers, and stunned silence. The power of her clapback wasn't in its aggression, but in its restraint. She hadn't matched his volume. She had exceeded his substance. Online, the moment exploded. Hashtags surged. Respect I cerned, Crockett clapback, dignity wins. Clips circulated with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance," and "Mic drop of the year." The contrast was undeniable. Brown, red-faced and shrinking versus Crockett, poised and unbreakable. Even Brown's own expression betrayed him. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed tight, his shoulders sank ever so slightly. For perhaps the first time in his career, the booming voice that once defined him seemed irrelevant. He was staring at someone who couldn't be intimidated. Someone who had taken his greatest weapon and turned it into his undoing. And Crockett wasn't finished. She delivered her closing lines with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any shout could. "So you can raise your voice all you want, but I promise you this, my dignity will always speak louder than your anger." The room went still. No rebuttal came, no thunderous return volley. Judge Joe Brown, who had built an empire on never being silenced, had nothing left to say. In that silence, Jasmine Crockett's victory crystallized. It wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement. She proved that dignity, composure, and truth could dismantle arrogance in front of millions. And as the moment rippled outward, across living rooms, across timelines, across generations, it became clear that this wasn't just a clapback. It was a cultural turning point. Because when Jasmine Crockett spoke, the world listened. And when Judge Joe Brown shouted, the world realized just how small that noise could be. But as the crowd buzzed and the internet caught fire, the story didn't end there. The clapback was only the spark. The true impact was still to come. A shockwave of reactions that would stretch far beyond that room, shaking politics, media, and culture in ways neither Brown nor Crockett could have imagined. The silence in E. That room barely lasted a heartbeat before the outside world detonated. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's clapback flooded Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The moment spread like wildfire, reshared by strangers, amplified by influencers, dissected by commentators. It was no longer confined to a single debate setting. It had broken loose into the bloodstream of American culture. The hashtags told the story. Respect I cerned trended at the top of Twitter by nightfall, joined by Dar Crockett clapback and the dignity wins. Memes mocked Judge Joe Brown mercilessly, showing side-by-side images, his face twisted in fury next to Crockett's calm stare. Captions. Read, volume versus value, the shout that ended in silence, and when dignity walks in, arrogance walks out. TikTok edits looped her line, "My dignity will always speak louder than your anger," layered over dramatic soundtracks that turned her words into a rallying cry. Praise for Crockett rolled in from every direction. Grassroots activists called her response a masterclass in composure. Commentators marveled at the way she flipped the script. Even late-night comedians picked up the moment, replaying Brown's reddened face as a punchline before cutting to Crockett's poised retort. On Instagram, celebrities reposted the clip with captions like, "This is how you do it," and "unbothered, unshaken, unstoppable." Cable news channels latched onto the debate as the story of the week. Political panels replayed the video frame by frame, pausing to analyze Brown's interruptions, Crockett's body language, and the exact instant when the power dynamic shifted. One analyst remarked, "You can actually see the moment Judge Brown realizes he's lost control. It's written all over his face." Another declared, "This wasn't just a political exchange, it was a cultural reset. Influencers added their own spin. Podcasters called it the end of the old-school shout-down era. YouTubers uploaded breakdowns titled, "How Jasmine Crockett Silenced a Bully" and "Why Judge Joe Brown Will Regret This Forever." Reaction videos flooded timelines, people gasping, cheering, rewinding the clapback to savor the delivery again and again. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just Crockett's composure, it was what her response represented. Viewers saw themselves in her. The student silenced by a domineering professor, the employee cut off in a meeting, the daughter dismissed at the dinner table. Her words carried the weight of every underdog forced to sit quietly through arrogance and disrespect. For them, this wasn't just a viral clip. It was validation. The ripple effect was impossible to ignore. Younger audiences declared it their new favorite political moment, proof that authenticity and dignity could still break through the noise. Older generations recognized the shift too, some praising Crockett as a model for how to confront disrespect without sacrificing grace. Even critics of her politics begrudgingly admitted she had handled the exchange with stunning composure. Meanwhile, Brown became the butt of jokes. His once commanding presence was now reframed as desperation, his shouting replayed not as strength, but as weakness. Memes cast him as the outdated relic of an era that no longer had power. One viral post showed a fossil labeled "Bluster" circa 1990s next to Crockett's photo captioned "The Future." But beyond the humor, the moment resonated because it exposed something deeper, America's shifting definition of power. For years, the loudest voices dominated. Outrage sold. Intimidation passed as authority. Yet here was a counterexample. A young black woman dismantling that tradition with nothing but calm clarity. It was proof that composure could triumph over chaos. And that realization struck a cultural nerve. Community leaders invoked the moment in speeches. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of courage. Activists framed it as a call to action. If Crockett could stand tall in the face of arrogance, so could anyone fighting for dignity in their own lives. Narration summed it up simply. It wasn't just a debate moment. It became a movement. Because what happened that night was bigger than Crockett versus Brown. It became shorthand for resilience in the face of disrespect, a rallying cry for those tired of being silenced, and a reminder that dignity still has the power to upend arrogance. And while the internet buzzed and the media replayed the clapback endlessly, Crockett herself remained composed, never gloating, never spiking the ball. That restraint only added to her stature. She didn't need to celebrate. The people were celebrating for her. Yet beneath all the praise, one question lingered like a drumbeat. What lesson would the nation take from this? Would it remain just a viral clip? Or would it inspire something deeper? A redefinition of what true strength looks like in American life? That question led directly to the moral core of the story. And Jasmine Crockett, more than anyone, was ready to answer it. When the noise faded and the headlines began, to blur, what lingered was not Judge Joe Brown's shouting. It was Jasmine Crockett's calm. That contrast, chaos versus composure, bluster versus dignity, became the enduring image of the clash. Brown's raised voice was a fleeting moment. Crockett's steady reply was a lasting lesson. In the days that followed, people didn't quote his interruptions. They quoted her clarity. They didn't share his fury. They shared her restraint. And that difference revealed something vital. Arrogance might win attention in the short term, but justice and respect carry the power to silence it in the long run. The moral takeaway was unmistakable. Crockett had demonstrated that true authority is not about domination, it's about discipline. She showed that strength isn't measured by how loud you can shout, but by how firmly you can stand when shouted at. For millions watching, her composure became a symbol of something larger. The idea that dignity itself can be the most devastating rebuttal. The moment reminded America of its deeper values: fairness, truth, justice, respect. These were not abstract ideals, but living principles embodied in Crockett's response. She did not match Brown's anger, because fairness doesn't need to be loud. She did not try to humiliate him, because justice doesn't need to gloat. Instead, she modeled what it means to confront arrogance without sacrificing one's humanity. That restraint elevated her beyond the clash and turned her into a beacon of what leadership could look like. Her line, "My dignity will always speak louder than your anger," resonated because it applied far beyond that debate stage. It spoke to workers dismissed in boardrooms, students talked over in classrooms, and immigrants told their voices don't matter. It echoed in the hearts of anyone who has ever been underestimated. Crockett's mic drop wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who has faced disrespect and chosen to respond with pride instead of rage. The inspirational crescendo was clear. In a world that rewards noise, dignity is the real mic drop. That truth cut through the cynicism of politics and media spin. It reminded viewers that leadership rooted in values can still outshine theatrics, that authenticity can still break through a culture obsessed with outrage. And so the clash between Joe Brown and Jasmine Crockett became more than a viral clip. It became a parable, a story parents could tell their children about the power of calm over chaos, a story activists could carry as proof that dignity wins, a story that reaffirmed America's belief in the possibility of truth overcoming arrogance. As the dust settled, the lesson crystallized. Strength is not the loudest voice in the room. Strength is the one that endures after the shouting ends. And Jasmine Crockett, by holding her ground, gave America a glimpse of what that strength truly looks like. Because in the end, the gavel did not belong to Judge Joe Brown. It belonged to dignity. And dignity, once again, delivered the final verdict. From the very first shout to the final unshaken reply, the arc of this story was unmistakable. Judge Joe Brown tried to seize control with volume, banking on the same tactics that once made him a household name. But Jasmine Crockett didn't meet chaos with chaos. She met it with clarity. She met arrogance with composure. And in doing so, she flipped the script in front of millions. What began as a clash of voices became a lesson in values. The louder Brown pushed, the stronger Crockett's silence became. And when she finally spoke, her words didn't just quiet. A man who thrived on bluster. They reminded America that dignity is the weapon arrogance can never defeat. This wasn't just another debate moment. It was a reminder of something deeper. That justice, truth, and respect don't need to shout to be heard. They carry their own authority, an authority that lingers long after the noise has died down. Crockett proved that leadership is not about drowning others out. It's about standing firm, speaking with conviction, and letting dignity deliver the verdict. And so the story closes with one final line, one that captures it all. In the end, the gavel didn't drop. Dignity did. If this moment resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it into your own life and your own battles. Subscribe to this channel, join this community, and be part of a movement that believes in truth over arrogance, composure over chaos, and respect over disrespect. Because together we can prove that dignity still wins every time.